We continue now at the top of Daf Pei Chesam and Aleph Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 88a. The Gemara continues that Rabbi Yanai says there's no obligation of meiser on food at sheyira pnei habayis until it sees the entry of the house. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, biarti hakodesh min habayis. It says, I finished the kodesh, the holiness from the house. I took care of essentially my meiser obligations. Rashi says pnei habayis means sheikones derech haPesach. The point of Rabbi Yanai is the food has to be brought in through the door. Shu pnei habayis. That's called pnei habayis. V'lo derech gagos v'karfifos. Not through the roofs or through the enclosures. That's what Rabbi Yanai says. Rabbi Yochanan says afilu chotzer kovas, even if it's in the courtyard, that establishes an obligation for meiser. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, v'achlu b'sharecha v'saveu, that they're going to eat in your gates and they will be satisfied. Rashi says v'achlu b'sharecha v'nasato lalevi, talks about giving to the Levi, talks about the obligation of meiser mishash nichnas l'sharecha. There's an obligation of meiser according to Rabbi Yochanan from the moment it enters your gates. That's why even the chotzer is able to create the obligation. And the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan nami haksiv min habayis, but Rabbi Yochanan also doesn't it say from the house. It sounds like the obligation should be through the door of the house. Amar loch, he will say to you, chotzer dumya debayis. When we say chotzer, but it at least has to be similar to a house. Ma bayis hamishtamer, just like a house is secure, af chotzer hamishtamer. So too, the obligation of meiser only applies if it's in a courtyard that is secure. Rabbi Yanai nami haksiv b'sharecha. Rabbi Yanai also doesn't it say in your gates. What does he do with that pasuk? The Gemara says, ahumi boile dema'ayele derech shar. The point over there is he has to bring it through the gate into the house. La'afuke derech gagos v'karfifos delo. That comes to exclude if he's bringing it through the roofs or the enclosures, then there would be no obligation. Rashi explains, derech shar dafilu habayis lo kavale. Even the house is not going to establish a chiyuv meiser elakim ma'ayole derech shar biyasu, unless he brings it in through the gate. And the Gemara continues, Meisiv Rav Chanina Chozah. Rav Chanina Chozah asks a question from the brisa we brought above. It said in the brisa above that we learn from the word kanavshecha, kach nafsho shel poel. Like you, that's how we treat the worker. Ma navshecha ochelu pater, just like you would be pater from meiser. Af nafsho shel poel ochelu pater. So too, the poel, the worker also, if he eats it in this fashion, he's pater from meiser. Now the point over here is that you might have thought that the poel should be obligated, because maybe the poel is like a buyer, and so we were saying, no, that's not the case. The worker is not going to be obligated. And so the Gemara now says, we can infer from the brisa, halokeach, if you would have a genuine lokeach, if there really would be a buyer, so then chayiv, so then apparently there would be an obligation in meiser. And the Gemara says, my lav, is it not? Besada, is it not in the field? Meaning you see that you don't need to bring it into the house to have this obligation, or you don't need to bring it into the chotzer to have this obligation. And the Gemara says, no, Rav Papa says, hacha b'ta'ena ha'omedes begina v'nofen nota l'chotzer. And here we're talking about a fig tree that is standing in the garden, but the branches are already hanging out in the chotzer. They're hanging into the chotzer, and therefore it is in the chotzer, and that's why the lokeach is obligated in meiser. Uleman damar labayis, and according to the one who says, meaning according to Rabbi Yanai, who says that it's the house that creates the chiyuv, so the branches are hanging in the house. But the Gemara says that doesn't help at all. If so, balabayis nami nechayev. What do you have to talk about a worker for? Everyone's going to be chayev. The balabayis is also going to be chayev in such a situation. It sounded like we were saying that only the worker is obligated in this case, and not a balabayis. But if it's actually hanging into the chotzer or hanging into the house, the balabayis would also be chayev. And the Gemara responds to that, balabayis einov b'tei naso. The balabayis, he's looking at the actual tree. His focus is not on a few branches. His focus is on the whole tree, and the tree is not in the chotzer, or the tree is not in the house. However, velokeach, when it comes to the buyer, einov b'mecho, he's looking at what he's buying, which is the specific figs that are hanging in the chotzer or hanging in the house, and that's why he is obligated. That's why we have in this one particular case a distinction between the lokeach, the buyer, and the balabayis. And Rashi explains, Avalokeach chayev, again we infer from the pasuk, if we're excluding a worker, that implies a buyer would be chayev, the mekach mechshev leike gemar melacha, because the act of buying itself is considered like gemar melacha. So my lab besada, aren't we talking about in the field? Mekach lo adif mi gemar melacha. Now mekach should not be more than an actual gemar melacha, and therefore if the gemar melacha in the field is not enough, why is buying it in the field enough? And the Gemara answered, we're talking where it's nota lechotzer, where it's hanging into the courtyard, the mechitol shachaz The moment you detach it from the tree, it's already in the Chatzar, and therefore there's an obligation. And the Gemara said, well, if so, if that's the case, Balabayas Nami, by the owner also, Talishahi Gemar Malachta, uprooting it is the Gemar Malacha, Vahare Roa Pnei Abayis, and now it's either in the Chatzar or in the house. That should be enough to obligate the Balabayas as well. And the Gemara says there's a distinction between the Balabayas and the buyer. The Balabayas is Einov B'Teina, so he's looking at the whole tree. Ein Hanof Chasha Be'einov. He doesn't care about one branch. Hilkach HaKol Holech Achara Ikar. Everything goes by the main part of the tree. V'Ikara B'Chutz. The main part of the tree is outside. Hilkach HaSheyigmar Kol Lekitaso. Therefore, you have to finish collecting all of the fruits. V'Ikonis Labayis, and actually bring it into the house. And if you don't do that, Lav Gemar Malacha, it's not considered a Gemar Malacha. Whereas when it comes to the buyer B'Mecho, he's looking at what he's buying. That's the ones that he's detaching, the fruits that he's detaching. From the moment they're detached, they're in the house, and that's why the buyer is obligated. But the Gemara now continues and questions everything we said above. Is it really true that a buyer is chayiv on a doraisa level? Because the entire assumption over here is that the buyer is chayiv in meiser, and that's why the pasuk says the worker is not chayiv in meiser. As Rashi says, v'lokeach midoraisa mimechayiv, is lokeach really chayiv on a doraisa level? The itzrich lei lekra lafuke poel mitoras lokeach, because that's why we needed the pasuk to exclude a worker from being considered like a buyer. But is the whole thing even true when it comes to a buyer? V'atanya, but we learned in a brayso, why did the stores of Beis Hino, why were they destroyed? Shalosh shanim kodem Yerushalayim. They were destroyed 3 years before Yerushalayim was destroyed. Because they followed the Derabanan, meaning what was really usher on a Derabanan level. They said, we don't need to make it usher, we can just follow the actual instructions of the Torah and not follow the Rabbanan. Shahayu Omen, because they would say, Rashi says, Shal Beis Hino Shem Makom. Beis Hino was the name of a place. Shehamidu Divreya means Kilomar Masha Asr Midivrei Chachamim. What is really prohibited Midirabanan, Matzu Lo Heter Min HaTorah. They found a heter from the Torah. They didn't pay attention to the fact that it was Asr Midivrei Chachamim. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Peiches Amud Beis.